My name is Elizabeth Lacy. I was born January 12, 1945 in Parris Island, South Carolina, Beaufort County, South Carolina. I was there because my father was a Navy pilot who was stationed there during the war and was instructing other Navy pilots. We stayed in South Carolina for a very short period of time and then returned back to Wisconsin, which is where both my mother and father were born and raised. They met in college, at Carroll College. My dad was on a football scholarship, and they had been married, and we returned to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Both my father was from Fond du Lac, my mother from Waukesha, the Milwaukee area, and Dad settled in Oshkosh. He bought, at that time, getting out of the service, he bought a, I guess you'd call it today, a franchise for the Remington Rand Business Company dealership, and we began our family life in Oshkosh. It's a very, at that time, and still is, a very small town in kind of central Wisconsin, which, well known now. At the time, Oshkosh was kind of like a sneeze, and people couldn't understand it. I lived there all my life until, of course, I became an adult and left. My family stayed in Oshkosh. My brother, I have one brother who's 7 years younger than I am. He is now also an attorney, and he and his family stay in Oshkosh. Growing up in a small town in the Midwest was really a wonderful place to be. We had a lot of freedom. Of course, we didn't have all of the safety issues that parents are faced with now. We were very active. My colleagues, my peers at that time, I went to Catholic schools, a Catholic grade school, 1 year at a public school, and then a Catholic high school. The high school that I went to opened actually the year I started. It opened that year with sophomores and freshmen. I was in the sophomore class. So my class was the highest class for 3 years at this high school in the first graduating class. And the advantage to that, of course, was that you had no traditions, but you had to make your traditions. And it was a co-institutional institution. Boys were downstairs, girls upstairs, but we did cheer for the football games and had joint glee clubs and so forth. So it was a very challenging, as I look back on it. Of course, I didn't know the difference, but it was a challenging time because we did the first yearbook, we had the first baseball teams, we had the first basketball teams, had the first prom, all of those things. If they were going to happen, we had to do that. And that was very interesting. The city as a whole, too, treated its young people with, I think, an awful lot of respect and responsibility. We had a youth council that I was on and was chair of at one point, that was made up of all the students. And of course, at this point, now there were 2 high schools in town, but we did a lot with these citywide organizations, and we met in city council chambers, and we undertook projects and fundraising and that type of stuff. And we also had a junior theater that every summer had all the high school students in it, and we put on Guys and Dolls and Kismet and West Side Story, and did all the flats, did all. I remember that I was treasurer at one point and had to write a check for $1,000 for the copyright rights to be able to put it on. And I mean, I was junior in high school. I don't even know how I got to write it. Obviously, there was a co-signer, but that was what we did every night in the summer. The other event or activity that took a lot of my time was sailing. My father had been a sailor as a child, or as a young man, and I think I was 8 years old, bought me at that time a scow. It was an M16. Every weekend in the summer, obviously in Wisconsin, you didn't sail in the winter, we had races all summer long, and you had tournaments, and certain cups races would go over more than 1 week. And I sailed with my father for a year or so, and then he had another person, younger, sail with me. And by the time I was about 12, I think, or maybe 11 or 12, I was racing the boat with my own crew. And all of my friends, or a lot of my friends, you know, raced or had motorboats and would water ski around us while we were racing. And so that we lived on a lake. It was Lake Winnebago. And water activities were very, very much a part of our social environment. We didn't have, early on, we didn't have a public pool in the city. Everybody swam in the lake. That's where you swam. So that was a very, very big part of my life. We didn't sell the sailboat until I was, I think, a junior in college, and you know, just wasn't racing anymore. But that held with it not only the responsibility of taking care of the sailboat, which was substantial. These were wooden boats. These were not fiberglass boats, and you had to get them in and out of the water and varnish them and all of that all the time. Taking care of the sails, and we had 2 races, one on Saturday and one on Sunday. So you had all of that, plus just learning learning to deal with the weather and Mother Nature, and because we were out on the lake all the time, even during the week when we weren't, before we started working as kids. And our parents, I know they were there in the background and kept pretty good tabs on us, except we didn't really know that, and really, but knew that if we messed up, we'd be in big trouble. So we were, we had, for a small town, a lot of responsibility, but a lot of freedom, you know, riding your bike across town or to the library, or, you know, to school. I don't think I rode my bike to high school. I rode it to middle school, but not to high school. Being with friends was something we did all the time, and it was a fortunate time because you didn't have the safety issues that you had now. So that was what my growing up was like. I mean, we were busy and active, and I often laugh that I don't even remember my brother being around because he was so much younger than I was, and we just, you know, our lives were just very, very busy lives, academically, socially, and as a matter of, in its own way, it was giving back to the community, although those phrases weren't used at the time. It wasn't thought of as service or pro bono work or anything. That's just what you did. You were part of a community, and your activities in it were part of what made it go. Now, as I look back at it as an adult, I can remember my mom and dad being involved in lots of local activities, Rotary Kiwanis. I remember Dad selling peanuts at all the high school football games for Kiwanis. I liked them. They were little bags with salted in the shell, so I always liked when he brought the extras home. Mother did not work while I was growing up, although she went back to work when my brother, I was in college, and ultimately she went on and got her master's degree at, there's University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, taught, did a lot of academic advising, and retired as a tenured professor when she turned 65. So she had a whole second career, but I was not going on when I was at home. But my brother was very much aware of and involved in that. Dad kept his business until he sold it when he retired when he was 65. And while he never bought another sailboat, they did do a lot of boating on, they had cabin cruisers and traveled that way a lot. So,
well, let me
that's
kind of
about
follow. Yeah, let me kind of follow up on a few things that you mentioned. The town that you grew up in, how many people approximately?
It's about, I'd put the number around 50,000, something like that. Maybe it was a little less when I was younger. It might be a little bit more now, but somewhere right in that area. It was in the Fox River Valley, about 70 miles north of Milwaukee and 50 miles south of Green Bay.
And how diverse ethnically was the community?
Not at all. It was not an ethnically diverse community. The state wasn't very diverse. Now, except for, and there weren't, you were very much aware of your American Indian heritage, in the sense, I mean, it was Chief Winnebago, the chief of the Winnebago Indians. His statue's right in the middle of the park downtown. But there were very few, if in our part of the country, in our part of the state, very few Native Americans, although there were quite a few up in reservations in the northern and the western part of the state.
Do you think that had any influence on how you perceived your environment? Did anyone ever talk about or have in the programming any diversity?
No, they didn't. But I do think, in that regard, I grew up without any sense of discrimination. I mean, everyone was the same. I mean, I can remember when I went to college, my roommate was from Atlanta, great gal, and we had long talks about, at that point, in the 60s, that's when I was in college, about the Civil Rights Act was coming through, and a lot of talk. And of course, her life growing up was very different than mine in the sense of diversity issues. And I can remember talking with her, and her response to me, because I couldn't understand how, not that she felt, but how things could be going on in Atlanta at the time. This was the time of the, who was the, I guess he was the governor with the pickaxe and all of that, and the sit-ins and all of that. And I said, I just can't understand how people can do that. I mean, how can you treat people that way? And Carol was just great. She said, Liz, my mind agrees with you and my brain 100%, but I'm having trouble with my heart just because I have to get over some things that I grew up with. And I never grew up with that. And she was not in any way a vindictive or mean person, or but she just said, she just has to overcome some ways of living that she'd had for 18 years that I'd never had. So, good, bad, or indifferent, that is one of the distinctions, and just wasn't, it just never dawned on me that you would treat people differently. I couldn't believe the Jim Crow issues in the South. I just couldn't believe that really wasn't just some kind of, that it happened, or that it wasn't some kind of long ago history that it was happening now. It's something I wasn't aware of.
You grew up in the 50s. Was the town ever pushing any issues dealing with the Cold War? What kind of environment was there?
Well, we had our, we'd practice in the schools for air raids and get under your desk and, things like that. And we saw pictures of atomic bombs, and, it was, you knew about the Iron Curtain and that communism was bad. And of course, I was in a Catholic environment, so, and it was atheistic, and communism was atheistic, and, that made it really bad. And I can't say that I personally was that involved with the politics at the time, but it was a politically active area. Wisconsin was kind of populist. I think I would suspect my dad was a Republican, but I'm not even sure about that. My mom may have been a Democrat, but.
So you never really heard any political discussions?
No, not particularly. Remember, this was the Eisenhower years, true, because it was the end of the war, and of course, at that point, I'm sure my parents were very focused on trying to make a life. My dad's, working, getting a house, getting their lives back together, because he was stationed prior to being in South Carolina. He was in the Aleutian Islands for months. I don't know how long, really. But they'd been apart for a while, and so now they were really trying to build this family, and it was, things were rather prosperous, as things go at that point in time, and so it really wasn't until I got into college that politics became, really an issue. I mean, I remember clearly the JFK nominations and elections, and seeing those on little TVs and out on our porch and things like that. So by about that time I got involved, but I don't remember heated political discussions with my parents or parents' friends. There may well have been. I just was far too busy with the things in my life, concerned about their lives. So.
I was wondering, you said you went to Catholic school, starting with high school.
Oh no, starting with grade school.
Grade school.
Mm-hmm.
What was what was what, let me rephrase this. What led to you going to Catholic school versus the public schools?
We were Catholic.
And so,
I mean, that was, that's what you did.
and so,
And Oshkosh had probably, I bet we had 8 Catholic schools, elementary schools. I mean, there were a lot of parishes and a lot of, you remember this is the kind of a German community. I mean, there was a lot of Catholics, there was a lot of Norwegians. I mean, there were just lots of Catholic schools.
and so what was the name of your...
St. Mary's was my parish
was the elementary school. And
Mhm.
what about did you have middle or junior high at this time?
The school St. Mary's went up through 8th grade. 8th grade, yeah. And no, actually it went through 9th grade at that time. My 9th grade year, I went to a public, they were called junior high. You had 7th, 8th, and 9th, and then high school was 10, 11, and 12. That has changed now, and actually they built this new high school, Catholic high school, which was 9, 10, 11, and 12, and so there were some changes going on. But then I went to the Catholic high school when it opened.
And was it the same name?
No, it was called Lourdes High School. It was a city, there was just one Catholic high school, it was a city-wide high school. Up until that time, all the kids that graduated from the Catholic schools would then go to the public high school. There was just one public high school.
And how many students that you recall were in the grade school versus when you went to high school?
Well, remember, we were talking about small towns and a long time ago. In grade school, I mean, I bet we had 40 kids in a class. That wasn't 35. I don't think that was unusual. And there may have been 2 grades of each. The high school, it's hard for me to really remember, because we went every year, we added a class until we graduated. I'll bet there were maybe 150 in each one of our classes, maybe. It was smaller, clearly it was smaller, because it was new. It had no track record in terms of what the education would be. And it was a tuition base. It wasn't terribly expensive at the time, but for a lot of families, it was different than just your local elementary Catholic school. So it was a good-sized school. I mean, it wasn't small. It wasn't teeny, but...
Well, when you first went to school, did you have a favorite subject?
Well, I thought I was going to be a math major. I liked that. And English, I always liked English. Science was not one of my favorite things by any means.
What attracted you to math? Because that's unusual for women, especially during that period, to want math.
I liked the certainty of math. I liked the formulaic aspects of it. That's what I liked about it.
And were you encouraged to pursue that?
Well, yeah. I got off of math because when I went to college, it became the new math with, greater than, less than, and all, and that wasn't for me. So I got out of math very quickly after my first college class in math. I mean, you had to take some prerequisites, but I like the much more clear numbers stuff. I didn't like greater than and less than stuff. It didn't make any sense.
Now, you indicated that you like literature.
Mm-hmm.
What was always your favorite genre of literature?
Probably novels. I mean, I read a lot of, I remember reading Vanity Fair and the Dickens stuff, and I read all the time. I loved to read, and I still love to read. But that was, I'd read magazines, I'd read just about anything that was there. I loved those summer book reading clubs where you'd fill in a roll on the Caterpillar every time you read a book or something like that. I really read just a lot.
Was this coming from your parents or?
Probably from my mother. She had been an English major, and reading was always high on her favorite things to do list. And I'm sure she not only introduced me, probably indoctrinated me might be a better word, but we always had books around. We always had magazines and newspapers around, and reading was a very important part of my life.
And let's go back a little bit to your theater experiences. Were you actually on stage or were you behind the scenes?
If the chorus was big enough, I was on stage. I did some of that. I did a lot of glee club and choral stuff in high school, but you know, couldn't really compete with the real singers. And I did a lot of the backstage stuff in terms of, well, I mentioned I was treasurer, handling all the money, making sure things were organized and props were where they were supposed to be, you know, that type of thing.
So what was your favorite job in the theater?
Oh, I just liked all of it. I mean, it was, you know, it was the kind of thing on a summer night for Monday through Friday nights. Maybe it was Thursday night. We had an adult director and adult music. They were always musicals, music director. But everything else was, I mean, that's where everybody was. I mean, that's what we did. And it was in a real theater that they let us use. And it was, you know, obviously a good part of it was just the social aspect of it. You know, that's where all your friends were. That's what you did.
And you said that you loved sailing and that you loved to race, and that's a little unusual for women to really be involved in racing, or was that unusual in your area?
Again, it was not that unusual. We had a fleet of, say, maybe 20 M16s, both in our club or you know, in Oshkosh. There were, I can think of 3 other women right now. 2 were a little bit older, like a year or 2 older, and 1 was a year younger than I was, who were sailing their own boats. And then they were crews, too. I mean, I'm really talking about the skippers versus the crews, and then some women crewing on the sailboats. I mean, I didn't give it a second thought when I was doing it. I really didn't. It was just what you did. You know?
So when you would have these races, were they just against other women who were sailing?
Oh, no. It was the whole M16 fleet, and you had a senior and junior championship. Now they only had 1 race. Well, they had more than one because you had A's, E's, D's, C's, and M's, and well, we really didn't have many D's, A's, C's, and M's. So there were 3 different races, but within the M class, there was 1 race. But see, you got points depending on where you came in, and it would be divided between the juniors and then the adults, and so they scored us differently and scored the seniors differently.
So when you were in high school, did you have in your mind what you wanted to do for your career?
No.
Did you have any idea that you wanted to go to college, or was that a choice that you made? Or
well, I mean, it was a choice, but it was an expectation. I mean, of course you went to college. I mean, that was what you did. That was what you were supposed to do. And, you know, the high majority of my friends all went to college. I mean, it wasn't, you know, I probably wouldn't have had a choice, but I didn't view it that way. That I did want to do. I mean, I wanted to go to college. Both because I knew that you needed to have a college degree to do whatever it is you were going to do, and also to see something different than Oshkosh.
Did you find yourself being very competitive academically in high school?
I was valedictorian in my class, so yeah, I was competitive.
And did that competitiveness extend into the choices of which colleges you applied for?
Well, yes and no. Once again, you have to realize that academic advising and knowledge about colleges was very different back in 1962 than it is now. And also, as I said, I was coming from a high school that I was in the first graduating class, so there was not a lot of track record in terms of our advisors. I think my advisor was a nun, actually, and she could tell me about Catholic schools, but I mean, you just didn't have a national view of available colleges for me. I wound up going to St. Mary's College at Notre Dame, which was, of course, in South Bend, Indiana, and that I probably was as far away to college as anybody was. Lots of people would go to, you know, to Minneapolis, or, of course, the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Marquette, Some went as far as Chicago, but that was considered to be really pretty far away. Of course, when I got to St. Mary's, I learned about all like the Ivy League schools, the sister schools who were still in existence at the time. I thought, why didn't they tell me about any of those? Well, it just wasn't, you just didn't do that. I mean, people didn't travel that far. So both geographically, I mean, and I knew I wanted to go to a good college, one that had a solid academic program. So St. Mary's fit the bill.
Tell me about your experiences in college.
Well, a lot like high school. I mean, it was a college, it was not a high school, obviously. And of course it had it's across the street from Notre Dame, and so we had a lot of interaction with Notre Dame. I loved my experience at St. Mary's. It was academically very challenging. I did well, but I can't say enough about that, what that school did and what it exposed me to. Of course, it had people from all over the country. I mentioned my roommate was from Georgia, and one from Oklahoma, one from Michigan, and it really, that was a international, well, at that stage not international, but certainly broadened my understanding of the entire landscape of the country, and really went and visited with friends and learned a lot more about, and all of a sudden huge horizons opened. I majored in, well, I was going to major in English, and then I discovered that that was really English literature, which I was interested in something broader than just English literature. So I switched to history. I was a history major in English and philosophy and education minor. My dad said I had to be able to do something when I got out. They had a course, or a major then, called Christian Culture. It's now called Humanistic Studies. I would have loved to do that, but my father kind of put his foot down on that one. He said, no, you have to be able to get a job when you get out of the school. So, no, college was wonderful. Again, student government, we wrote the we created it, rewrote the rules, involved in class officers, yearbooks.
What made you want to get into student government?
Well, I'd done it all through high school. Well, and also in high school, if it was going to get done, we had to do it. There wasn't, we didn't have any patterns. What are you going to do? Just have a school that doesn't have anything but classes? And no high school kid wants that, that's for sure. And also, I think that both the co-institutional setup and then, of course, the all-women's college at St. Mary's also said, if you want to do something, you've got to do it. I mean, there was no hesitation, there was no social stigma, there was no game playing. You just did it. You raised your hand and said, okay, I'll do that one, and went on ahead and worked it out. So I never had the kind of, at those points in my life, of feeling circumspect or circumscribed by the gender issue. You just did it. And it's a lot of fun to do those things. It really is. You get involved with the school, we did tutoring in the community, we did, you name it, we figured out a way to do it. Couldn't figure out a way around some of the rules, but pretty much we got it done.
Which rules were those?
And I would say, I need to add this, that the nuns in both the high school and college setting were incredibly supportive and encouraging of letting us run with our ideas, but giving us the kind of environment where they wouldn't let us, really do something that would hurt us. I mean, I don't mean they were by rules, but they kept up with where we were going and what we were doing, and yet let us really run with various balls that we wanted to run with. So,
what were the few rules you weren't able to change?
You couldn't wear slacks on campus without a coat over them. You had, you know, they had a lot of parietals. I mean, you had to sign in and sign out every time you left campus, and there were certain restrictions. And if you were going to go away from the weekend to visit a friend, if you're going to go away from the weekend, you had to have a note from your parents saying where you were going and where, you know, this kind of thing. I mean, you know, you didn't have e-fares on the weekends. We didn't have cars. It was a residential campus. Basically, everybody except A students lived on campus in the dorms. You know, there were some of those kinds of things that we couldn't.
So,
but we restructured a lot of the like residence halls and resident assistants and some of the student government. We restructured a lot of that, which it was time for that to happen, and the nuns they knew that, but they were really glad that we were kind of taking the laboring oar, so that the structure we came up with was one that we were invested in, and not just something that they had top down us.
So what prompted you to want to change some of these things?
Well, they had been at that school for probably 45 years when it was to wear hat and gloves to go downtown, you know, things like that. The school structure that we had that did not have a structure which really allowed student input into activities and decision making on campus. And the nuns realized that it was time for us to do that, time to give us some of that. And it's true, give us some of that responsibility, and the times required it. Because that was, you know, you really weren't going to get, I'm chair of the alumni board now, and so I can see this, but they knew that they weren't going to be able to continue to attract the caliber and quality of academically or activity-wise of student that they wanted if the school didn't adjust, and it had over the years and still is doing this to the type of student that was coming out of high school. I mean, they had to make those adjustments.
So you had indicated earlier that it was in college that you really began to think about or talk about politics. Mm. So was this sort of a natural segue as you tried to adjust the rules that you began to look at the broader political spectrum? Well,
yes and no. I mean, our world was still focused on South Bend, Indiana, and Niles, Michigan, and maybe sometimes Chicago. I mean, you know, the everyday life was still very much campus-oriented. But within that, I mean, we became our freshman year, one of the first weekends we were there was the weekend that, or the time when JFK ordered the embargo of Cuba, and we had the Bay of Pigs issues and all of that. And so, well, like one of my roommates, her husband was actually, not at the time, I mean her future husband, was on one of the Navy ships that was involved in this. So we became very, and television. I mean, we didn't have TVs in our rooms, but we had them in big gathering places, like, you know, recreational areas within the dorms. So we became much more aware of what was going on. It's hard, and then of course Kent State came up, but that was quite a bit later. It's hard to say that those directly translated into what we were doing, but it was all part, I think, of the maturation process.
So no, around that time, and actually talking about 63, 64, you had mm-hmm. the SNCC organizers going mm-hmm. to the Midwest. Did you hear about any of that?
No, we did not have a lot of that on our campus. I'm not sure about Notre Dame as organizers. I'm 63, 64 would have been my sophomore year. And I don't remember a lot of that. By our senior year, the Vietnam issue was really coming to the fore. And, you know, of course, not a lot, but some of my friends at Notre Dame had been in ROTC, and of course were getting ready to be shipped out. And it was, the guys had, I think, a couple legs up on us because they were, you know, we didn't have a lottery then, it was just draft. And there was a lot of talk about that. To the extent it translated into what we did or didn't do had much more to do with our personal lives, perhaps, than our institutional lives.
This was also the period when the women's rights movement was making a larger splash through its more radical arm, the feminist movement. Did that have any impact?
I really think that this is, we're a little early in my college years. The law school years very much so, but you know, 65, 66 was still, at least maybe it just hadn't gotten up to the Midwest yet. But you know, as I look back at it, it didn't need to come to St. Mary's. I mean, we were there. Now, the downside was that it is very true, at the end of my time at St. Mary's, there weren't a lot of options. It's kind of like you went through, you know, grade school, middle school, high school, you know, knowing you're going to get you this education, and never ever saying you can't take that course or you can't do this because you're a woman. I mean, I never felt that I didn't have exactly the same expectations placed on me as on any other male in any class I was ever in. It just didn't happen. But then you kind of come to the end of college, and it's like a railroad train that just drops off. Unless you were going to get a graduate degree, generally in some liberal arts area, or go for a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship or something like that, it's over. You're done now. You know, where do we go from here? And of course, also a lot of my contemporaries were getting married right after high school. I mean, right after college. Well, some after high school, but after college. And their work horizon basically was to support their husbands in graduate school, which of course is what mine, and that's what I did too. And you know, you didn't think of a career, you thought of a job type of a thing. And so luckily, because it was right at the time of equal pay for equal work, encouraging women to go ahead and to get graduate degrees and to look into like programs that, say, a phone company would have, or a bank for middle management to start training people. You know, luckily that started about that time, but there wasn't much, you didn't go online to find it like you do now. There was no online, for one thing, but you know, that type of thing didn't exist. And I believe, and I don't know if that there's any work been done on this, maybe there has, but I think a lot of women that you could say lucked into these positions or even into professional schools occurred because a lot of the guys had been drafted or were leaving to go into National Guard units, and as a result there were slots that were open, and they weren't taking women, of course. I mean, certainly weren't drafting them. And you know, the law schools, for example, decided that as long as you were in that chair and paying that tuition, so what if you were a girl? And the same with some businesses. I mean, they had people to train, and I mean, you're talking about women who had graduated from well-respected institutions. That they certainly were capable. They just hadn't been first choices before. And you had the pill. So the combination of the pill and where you now really could have plan a career, and the war, and women saying, wait a minute, I just got this degree, where do I go now? Really opened things up right about that area. So right about that, I mean, that era, that time period, that time frame.
So let's take a look at your personal life. Once you're in college and you're approaching that period when you have to make a decision. What do you do once you finish college? What was going on for you?
Well, of course, many of my colleagues, many of my fellow students, women students, as we get to junior and senior year, every vacation are coming back engaged, and all of a sudden marriage, and that was in my future too. I mean, I got married the August after I graduated. Although I had 4 roommates, and I can remember coming in at one point saying, if I see another bride magazine around, I'm going to get sick, and I don't know what I'm going to have on my napkins at my wedding. You know, I mean, that was very, you have to understand, that was a very much talked about, that's what was happening for most women. And they were going wherever that was that their husbands were going, grad school, or some were getting married quickly because of the war, you know, that type of thing. And that's what I was doing. I went and taught school in Austin, Texas. My husband was a second-year law student at that point.
Now,
that's what I did.
Where did you meet your husband?
He was at Notre Dame. He was a year ahead of me at Notre Dame.
And how did you all meet?
Probably through a mixer, you know, just on campus, kind of. I mean, I know that's how we met. I can't, it wasn't like a blind date or something like that, but I think we just met and started seeing each other and pretty much dated all the way through. I met him the end of my freshman year of college.
And give us the full name of your husband.
Well, this was my first husband, and his name was Salvador Levatino.
And where was he from?
Dallas.
And when did you all get married?
In August of 1966.
And what did he influence your view of potential careers?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, we got married. I went to Austin. I taught school in a Catholic school, and
what did you teach?
I taught fourth grade, 35 kids in an unair-conditioned classroom. And I loved the kids and I loved the teachers, but I knew I wasn't going to do this for the rest of my life. And I had applied to graduate school at the University of Texas and been accepted. And I was thinking about upping and revitalizing that thing, because I think I was paid $300 a month for 9 months. That it wasn't like we were making a lot of money here, and it was getting to be the end of mid to end of that year. And my husband came home one day and said, "I think you'd like to go to law school. Here are the LSAT applications. Why don't you fill them out and take the test?" It never dawned on me to go to law school, because he was in law school and girls didn't go to law school. I mean, that just wasn't part of my horizon. But then as I sat and thought about it, I thought, you know, I know him, I know all his friends, and I know if they can do it, I can do it. I mean, it was not a matter of not being able to do it. So I filled it out and passed and started law school the next fall. I mean, that is how, what I would have done when he got out of law school, I don't know. I mean, that I never got to that point. So, but that's how I went to law school. Pardon?
Why did he encourage you to go to law school?
Because he thought I'd enjoy it and would be a good lawyer. And I wasn't earning enough money at that point to say that it would be, you know, we couldn't borrow money or work part-time to support ourselves, and that, of course, that's what we did. And at that time, the tuition at the University of Texas Law School was something like $400 a semester for residents. So, you know, we were really looking at not the cost of law school, but how, you know, how are we going to live? Could we either, and loans were different then than they are now, but, you know, he drove a school bus and I worked part-time at a law firm, you know, stuff like that. But he knew I didn't, the teaching situation, had I gone into secondary ed, I may well have stayed there. It might have been fine, but he just knew that I just needed a change from that, and he knew what law school was like, so he said.
Well, it's very unusual for a man, and especially a husband, to encourage the wife to join him in law school. Explain to me a little bit about him as a person.
Well, I mean, he was he was a smart, a very nice guy. I mean, he really was. And when I went to law school, he did say, "Now, it's going to be very important that you get to know the people in your own section, in your class, because you'll have study groups with them. And, you know, I can't really, if you think I can help you, you're probably making a mistake, because I'll probably have had different professors. You know, you really have to be able to know the subject matter and what each individual professor requires of you." And he was, when I started, it was his last year, so he was in a whole different arena of classes than I was.
So after he finished law school, what did he do?
He clerked for a federal district judge for a year or two, and then he let's see. At one point, he then was the legal counsel to the president of the University of Texas for a number of years. And then he went out, I believe, on his own, and he still has his own firm, is practicing. I don't know how big it is or who's with him in Austin.
And what about you?
I went to law school, worked part-time for a law firm. When I graduated, I thought we would probably, he had been talking about wanting to go back to Dallas, so I was a little hesitant to interview with a law firm because I didn't know how long we'd stay in Austin. So I worked for the Texas Legislative Council, which is the bill drafting, committee staffing arm of the legislature, and I worked for them for about 2, maybe 3 years, and then a new attorney general was elected in Texas, and he asked me to go to work for him. So I did that and worked there really until I came here.
So was politics something that you were interested in?
I was very involved in politics in Texas. Of course, when you work for the legislature, how can you not? But also at that time, it was very exciting because Barbara Jordan was a state senator at that time. There was a woman named Sissy Farenthold who had been a state representative and was a serious gubernatorial candidate. I mean, very serious. She was the major party candidate. There was Sarah Weddington was a good friend of mine and was, she had just argued Roe versus Wade, and then became a state rep. In fact, we sat in my bedroom kind of flipping a coin, not bedroom in our house, flipping a coin trying to decide who should run for that spot. It was had been held previously by a guy named Harrington, I believe, who had it for like 20 years. And Ann Richards and Sarah and myself and others were trying to decide, who we thought that a woman should run for it and who should be, and Sarah ran. Ann Richards was, well, at that time, she wasn't even county commissioner. She had not been in an elective office at all. Her husband was a ACLU attorney and good friend. I mean, there was, Kay Bailey Hutchinson was, at that time, the stringer for the Houston Post on the floor of the House and Senate. It was just there were a lot of women around who were very active in politics and very different levels. So it was very exciting. There was a lot going on.
So did you find that perhaps in law school, that's when your real interest in at least politics at the state, perhaps national level, really took off? Or
well, of course, yeah. And in law school, that was when you had a lot of the Vietnam, the Kent State, the Vietnam, the famous picture of the soldier with the flower in his gun, and I can remember that they were having a student. Well, I guess I was in working at that point, but some kind of a student demonstration, and there were armed guards around the Capitol, which was just the scariest thing. I can't imagine having to walk into your Capitol with these armed militia, National Guard. It was very scary. And of course, Lyndon Johnson was from Texas, and a lot of Sam Rayburn. I mean, it was just a hugely political state, and I was an adult then, and Bobby Kennedy and all of that was going on, and it was hard not to be swept along. I don't mean swept along, but get involved in it. And then, of course, when you work for the legislature, and then I work for the Attorney General's office, so you are exposed to a lot of political issues. So,
did you find yourself at that point gravitating toward one political party or the other?
Well, at that point, the Democratic Party was about the only party in Texas. I mean, there were Republicans, don't get me wrong, but that was certainly the...
And did you begin talking politics with your parents, or was that still...
Not really with my parents, because remember, they're still up in Wisconsin. They're not part of my daily life. It's not that I avoided it, but it wasn't part. I mean, it's not like they lived in Austin where you had dinner on Sundays. We'd see them 2 or 3 times a year at the most.
So what happened over the course of, say, the next 5 years? After law school, you were working in the Attorney General's office and then in the legislature. So tell me a little bit, what happened after that?
What did I do when I was doing that work? Well, In the legislature, I had done a lot of bill drafting and done things like draft consumer protection laws and ethics legislation, things like that. And then when I went with the Attorney General's office, it was Texas. There was a time in Texas that it was like Texas's own Watergate. It predated the Watergate, but there was a huge upheaval. Lots of the elections, the Attorney General, the new Speaker of the House, the Senate. I mean, a lot of people were elected on reform bases. So I was kind of on loan to the legislature for a while. Was involved in getting past the consumer protection legislation that had been drafted a couple years ago. I was a counsel to the House Ethics Committee that was redoing all their Board of Ethics review and all of that. They were working on amending the Constitution, and I was deeply involved in all of that and trying to figure out all the, you know, if Article 1 passed but 2 didn't, what happened, and all the transition stuff. We did get the Consumer Protection Act passed, and we did get the ethics passed, but the Constitution didn't fly. I was doing arguments in at that time, Fifth Circuit, United States Supreme Court, involved in redistricting litigation, did that litigation, offshore boundary disputes between Texas, Louisiana, and the United States government. It was kind of called Who Gets to Drill for Oil Where. Just some First Amendment cases in the Supreme Court. I mean, it was just a very busy time.
Were you volunteering to kind of expand your portfolio of things at this time, or were you simply given these tasks?
I was just given them. I mean, my Attorney General was an individual named John Hill. I started out as Assistant Chief of the Antitrust and Consumer Protection Division, and then became Special Assistant to the Attorney General. And what I did with that really was review all appellate work coming out of the office, as well as do a good bit of it. I worked with the senior attorneys on staff, and we did the litigation that I mentioned. Then I became chief of the state and county division, which was the biggest division in the office. And I didn't do that too long, because that's when I moved here. But I mean, it was just, I can remember my first day on the job when I became special assistant it was right. Actually, they had me doing this while I was antitrust chief, or assistant chief. The Supreme Court had just issued its opinion in a redistricting case in Roe versus Wade, and my job, because we were the Attorney General's office, was to file the motions for rehearing in those two cases. I'm like, what? That was pretty heady for someone at that time that was, 30 years old. It was pretty, not even 30. So it was there was a lot going on, and at that time, the setup was such that any time a state law was challenged as unconstitutional, it would be heard by a 3-judge panel, federal judges, and then there was a direct appeal to the United States Supreme Court. It wasn't certiorari, didn't go through any of the circuits, so we had a lot of activity with the Supreme Court, and that was just kind of the grist of daily stuff was, I can remember we had the group that oversaw the juvenile detention in Texas. It was a huge case about their, whether the state was treating them properly or not. We had the multi-district, single-member district litigation for redistricting was up there. We had what type of disclosure one could require on political advertising was another case we took up there.
How many?
I know, we had an impeachment that I handled. They impeached a judge, and we had the impeachment proceedings in the House, and they issued the articles of impeachment, and then we had a trial in the Senate. I mean, the Senate was the jury. It was just unbelievable. Oscar Carrillo, and he was a judge down in the southern part of the state, which was a very scary part at that time, and they had state police all over, and tried the case in the Senate of Texas.
What was the outcome?
He was impeached. He was convicted of impeachment, yeah.
On what grounds?
It was a use of state and county employees and funds for personal gain, fix it. I mean, and basically getting state money and using it for his own stuff. I mean, just ran the county. And
how long were you special assistant?
Well, almost. I switched jobs about 3 or 4 months before I moved here. So most of my time at the Attorney General's office.
How many hours a week were you working at that?
Oh, lots. I mean, yeah. Yeah, we worked a lot.
Were you trying to establish a family at that point?
Well, that really wasn't the issue. That isn't an issue at that point.
And so, what prompted your move to Virginia?
Well, my husband and I had been divorced, and I was working for the Attorney General's office. And I was at a national or an Association of Southern Attorney Generals meeting in Hilton Head, again, South Carolina. And my husband was an Assistant Attorney General in Virginia, and I met him there, and we probably kept Braniff out of bankruptcy for a while. And one of us had to move if we were going to get married, so I moved, and that's how I came here.
And so, tell us your husband's name.
Dennis Patrick Lacy Jr., known as Pat.
And when did the two of you get married?
We got married in September of 1976.
And what position did he have in Virginia?
He was Chief Deputy Attorney General. Well, he was a Deputy Attorney General and then Chief Deputy Attorney General under Andy Miller. And then Tony Troy.
And so when you moved to Virginia, did you already have a posting someplace, or were you? No,
I mean, actually, my Attorney General wanted Pat to move to Texas, and he'd give him a job, and Andy said he'd give me a job. I didn't work from 76 to 82. Pat had 2 children from a previous marriage, and they lived with us, and then we went on and had 2 more children. So up until, well, I did work part-time. Some of the time I worked for Carrington Williams when he was a member of the legislature during the session. I think just one session, and then I did some legal contract work for various law firms and for the legislative services too.
And how old were your stepchildren when you?
6 and 7.
So you really were you all the primary caretakers?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you really had a ready-made family.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And when did you have your 2 children?
Michael was born in 1977 and David was born in 79.
And so you really had your hands full. Were you looking to go back out into the mix?
Well, I mean, I always felt like I would go back to work at some point. Yes, I thought I was just on kind of an extended vacation, although vacation may not have been the right word. But before I met Pat, well, I had known Andy and Tony and Jerry Beliles. I'd worked with them. Actually, Jerry and I had worked on some Outer Continental Shelf litigation. Stemming from my work, we'd had to use the international law of the sea as a basis for the boundary case that I had mentioned. And Jerry, with the Attorney General's office here, was working on a similar issue with regard to the Outer Continental Shelf. And attorneys general and their staff often collaborate and work with each other. So I'd known Jerry for a long time. As I said, even longer than I'd known Pat. And when he was elected Attorney General, he called and said, "I want you to come to work for me." And I said, "Whoa, wait a minute. David's just 2 and I'm getting a whole morning out just to myself here now. I don't know if I want to go back to work." But we talked, and so I went back to work for him in January of '82 when he took office. So that's how I went back to work.
And so tell us about your work.
It was great. I worked, of course, at the Attorney General's office. I was chief of the at that time it was called the litigation section, which oversaw consumer protection, antitrust, opinions, collections, and general litigation. We handled the primary, the more serious construction, constitutional litigation. And I did that until April of '85. I remember this was when there was a vacancy on the State Corporation Commission. The House had elected Jim Thompson. The Senate had elected another individual. There was a mandamus action brought by then Speaker A.L. Philpott to have the Secretary of State, or the elections people, recognize Thompson as the victor because he had more votes. And that was heard, it was being argued, it was argued before this court. And one of the guys in my division actually argued it, I recall. And then the court announced it was going to come out with its decision on a Friday at noon. It's unusual. I don't know that they've ever done that since. And this was in April. In fact, I think it might have been April 1st, in fact. Anyway, shortly before the General Assembly was to come back for its veto session. And I remember Jerry Belial said to me Thursday night, he said, wear something presentable tomorrow. I'm like, I always wear something presentable, but anyway. So that day, the decision came down at noon. I got a call from Rob's office about shortly thereafter saying, where are you going to be? We want you to stay in touch with us. They called me over for an interview. Rob came back. Well, Rob was there, Governor Rob was there at the beginning of the interview, but participated a little bit in it. It was really, Eva Teague was in it, and Tim Sullivan. It seems to me a couple other people did the majority of the interviewing. And I got a call about 7 o'clock that night saying, do you want to be on, would you take an appointment at the State Corporation Commission? Pat was in California on a business trip. I said yes. We had a press conference. The next day was the primary for the gubernatorial race that Governor Belial was in, along with Dick Davis. And I remember he called after the whirlwind day. Governor Belial did, and said, "You've just been appointed a judge. Take that bumper sticker off your car." He said, "I could just see a Times-Dispatch press picture." So I did, and well, then I was on the State Corporation Commission.
So you were completely blindsided by this appointment.
Yes, I was. I hate to use the word blindsided because it was a wonderful thing. So right. I think perhaps unaware, unsuspecting, let's put it that way.
I was curious as to whether you had an opportunity when you were working with Governor Belial, or some of your other previous postings, if you had an opportunity to have any interaction with the State Supreme Court.
With the State Supreme Court, well, I had, in both Texas and Virginia, in the sense of cases. I hadn't ever argued a case before, but I'd reviewed all of the stuff that went up there and actually in Virginia too. I'd worked with the justices on not directly representational issues, but on some other things. But this was to the State Corporation Commission, right. Not to the court.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
No, I was just wondering if you had an opportunity prior to eventually moving up the ladder, so to speak, with interacting at all with the Virginia State Supreme Court. Well,
in terms of filing briefs, reviewing briefs, knowing about cases. When we were on the Attorney General, when I was in the Attorney General's office, we were involved in a case called Pulliam, which had to do with whether or not judges were subject to 1983 litigation, and we had Governor, well, at that time, Attorney General Blouse actually argued that case, and I had worked with the then justices to have the court on, I mean, we dealt with them kind of more as clients type things. Mm-hmm.
What kind of adjustments did you have to make once you were asked to join the state corporation court?
Well, it's a huge adjustment because you're no longer an independent lawyer. You're a judge. I mean, you're subject to the judicial canons of ethics. You are, we were running an agency of 500 plus people. All of the subject matter was, some of it was new to me. Certainly the depth of it all was new to me, but I mean, I had been supervising the Consumer Counsel group, and which was the group in the Attorney General's office that appeared before the commission representing consumers. So I'd read a lot about, and this was at the time of the telecommunications breakup, the AT&T case, and a lot of restructuring there, a lot of differences in rate making and so forth. And I'd read I'd reviewed and was aware of all of the positions that we had taken in all of the rate cases. And Jerry had sponsored as a legislator, well, no, I guess as governor, but as Attorney General had gotten a bill through that was called one rate increase a year that only allowed that. And so, I mean, I had a passing knowledge of everything that went on the commission, but I venture there weren't more than 100 people in the whole state that knew everything that went on at the commission. So there was the learning curve was pretty steep, as it is in any new job. There was a lot more traveling involved than I'd had, just because we did, for public utility commissioners and the other things, the insurance and all of that, a lot of the industries had seminars to get new commissioners familiar with what the thing was. And I suppose today they'd be looked at somewhat askance, but for example, I was in New York City for about a week actually, and it was put on by securities analyst firms, and it literally was a school. I mean, we were in school from like 8 o'clock at night, because the whole issue of return on equity and how utility commissions at that point, really there wasn't much competition. And it was important to the analysts as well as the utility companies that we had a passing knowledge of what this was when you were talking about return on equity and rate of return and things like that. And I mean, it was fun. I mean, it was exciting in a way. We were on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and you really learn by being there. But I remember that one, you would have classes at night, and they wouldn't start till everybody got there. So, you didn't want to irritate, and these were commissioners from all over the country. You wouldn't want to irritate your colleagues by coming in a half an hour late. Everybody was on time. So we did that, and like going to Bell Labs, and fiber optics was just coming in, trying to understand what that technology was, and how MCI differed from, we'd go to MCI. You just had to get a real understanding of the industry in order to make really knowledgeable decisions. Now, things are very different now, I know, so that was just back in the 80s, but that it did require, I remember one of the first weekends I was a commissioner, the Bath County pump storage plant had not actually been opened yet, and so they wanted me to get up there so I could literally see the tunnels and understand. I mean, I'd be in a hard hat with Jack Ferguson and going down, and just so that you have a real concept of what it is that they're talking about, rather than just kind of words on a piece of paper. So that kind of stuff was quite different.
Were there any particular cases or situations or issues that were particularly, I don't want to say challenging, but involved a lot of work on your part, or perhaps was surprising to you in some way?
Well, it wasn't surprising. I mean, I guess one could say it's surprising because you just are not aware of the depth of the issues that a given institution has. I mean, it's the same way as when I came on the court here. But there was a lot going on there. Yes, we had a challenging, there was a big insurance case at the time that was one of the first cases I had, but also the PURPA had just come into effect, and trying to deal with the utilities bidding for energy supplied by paper companies, and how do you, because we would have to approve these contracts. Now, how do you know what's a legitimate contract? Columbia Gas was going through the huge problem of having kind of bought into gas at certain prices and, you know, long-term contracts, and now the spot market had just gone crazy and companies were going into bankruptcy. And then the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we did a lot of testimony up there, and, you know, are they going to take over an area, or should the state still have some kind of say in it? So there was a lot of policy in all of those areas: telecommunications, energy. We had the securities. We had that at that point, which was, looks a little tame today, but Black Thursday or Black Tuesday, when the stock market fell, was during our, and then you had the beginning of financial advisors, and all of a sudden we were licensing financial advisors. So securities and exchange issues, a lot of that is insurance. We had all the state chartered banks and savings and loans. I mean, there was just a lot going on that time period.
Did this experience in any way systemically change how you looked at cases or how you looked at situations? Or did it simply add to your knowledge base?
I think it added to the knowledge base because, you know, the legal training remains just a unique and important aspect of being able to take your personal views, set them aside, and look at both sides of an issue. And then you do that as a lawyer, because any good lawyer needs to know the weakest part of his opponent's case. But then as the decider, as a judge or as a member of the State Corporation Commission, you really have to be able to either put yourself in each set of shoes or in neither sets of shoes and looking at it. And I can't say that those experiences changed the way I operated. Maybe much more aware of time management, because, you know, at this point too, I had 4 kids, and they were in middle school and grade school and PTAs and soccer and all this kind of stuff. So time management was really a new element of my life when I started doing all of this. But on a substantive basis, if nothing more, it certainly made me much more intent on trying to get as much information as I could, valid information, and not just shooting from the hip type of decision-making process.
So how long were you on the commission?
I was on the commission from April of '85 until January of '89.
And so tell us a little bit about what happened in that period, transitioning you from being on the commission to another very important appointment and election.
Well, there really wasn't much transition. Much like my appointment to the State Corporation Commission, Justice Poff very unexpectedly announced his that he would retire as of December 31, probably sometime in October. I'm not even sure, early November, something like that. And Governor Belials, and of course the legislature wasn't in session, and Governor Belials approached me and asked me if I would take this appointment. Although we went through, it was not well, I shouldn't say it was, it wasn't as extensive and certainly not as institutionalized as it is now in terms of interviews by local bars and state bar groups and things like that. We didn't do personal interviews. They, they looked at our resumes, and various groups recommended people at that time. I think it was the first time that had been done. And he went through that process, the governor did, and then announced my appointment. You'd think I remembered that date. I truly don't remember the date, because well, I'm not sure exactly when Justice Poff retired. Yeah, that's right. He retired as of December 31, and Jerry had announced that I would take over. And there the trickiness was that the legislature was coming into session the next week, and there were a number of legislators. And again, it was still all one party, both the governor's office and the two houses, although not huge majorities in some, that thought the legislature, he shouldn't have made the appointment, the legislature should have filled the appointment. And he said no, he was going to make the appointment, which he did. So I think I had a term, my initial term on this court, or on the Supreme Court, was, I don't know, maybe a month and a half, something like that. But I was elected then by the legislature for a full term.
So when did Governor Belials first approach you about his idea of appointing you to the court?
I really don't remember. I really don't.
Did you have any inkling that he was thinking along those lines?
I had inklings just from things that he said, but Governor Belials is a very he's a very circumspect individual, and he, above all, he believes in being prepared. And so I'm sure that any thoughts that his thought about appointing me to the court had been with him at some point, well before he ever mentioned it to me, because he really does his homework. He wants to be prepared. He looks at things from all sides, at every paradigm. He kind of will walk around, and he's very deliberate. And so I suspect it wasn't that he got this idea and gave me a call. I think he probably worked on it and thought it by, I don't know if he talked to anybody else beforehand or not, but I suspect this was not a spur of the moment thing.
Well, now this was a milestone for Virginia to have its first female justice on the court, and I was wondering what did you get any feedback from your friends, your associates, from your colleagues about that particular idea of being the first woman?
Well, I'm not sure what the question means. I think you mean people saying you shouldn't do that?
No, not necessarily you shouldn't do that, but what was their reaction? Because whenever something happens for the first time, people have a certain, not just emotional, but
okay,
intellectual
yeah, I understand
reaction to that whole
all right.
process.
Well, first of all, you have to realize that probably there are tens of people that are better, would better answer that question, because no one's going to look at me really and say, you got to be kidding. Why you? I mean, people were very gracious and were very excited, and I hope I'm realistic enough to know that it wasn't necessarily me personally. They were excited about the idea. I just happened to be the one that was there at that time and got it. But I mean, it was as much, the excitement was as much over the idea. The other thing you have to remember is, by that time Ronald Reagan had appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the United States Supreme Court, and there were a number of other courts around the country that had women on them. Virginia certainly wasn't the first. It wasn't the last, but it wasn't the first. So I guess one could say it was an idea whose time had come, and people were certainly were ready to embrace it and were pleased. On a personal basis, no, I didn't, other than, I don't even think my family, I guess my family even thought it was a good idea, but I would not have, and would not have expected to have gotten negative reactions or bad comments. I will say that the press was, I was very personally pleased. They although I certainly had been an associate of Governor Bliles at that point for many years, the majority of people really looked at what I had done, my professional track record, both in Texas and here, and I think I got I thought they were nice and realistic comments, that it wasn't just a woman, but that there was a qualification there that made it a legitimate appointment. I had gone through being the first deputy in Virginia, the first deputy in Texas, the first woman on the state corporation. I mean, it sounds like, I don't mean, I mean, I'm not blowing my, I mean, that's the fact. I mean, that's what it was.
Blazing the trail.
Yeah, I mean, it was, so I don't think that much about being the first woman. It's just as much as, well, getting the job done.
Now, once you were on the court, do you remember what your first day was like?
Well, my first day, I guess, was the investiture ceremony, and I certainly remember that. I had met with the justices. Actually, I'd had lunch with them, and had certainly met with then Chief Justice Carrico on a few occasions. Once the appointment had been made, but before, because Justice Poff didn't resign until the 31st of December, or he was still an active justice until that point. So the days kind of meshed together because I was doing stuff in both areas for a while, and then over here, the first, I can remember, and this story is nothing new, but I can remember that first week, I believe we had writ panels one day. That was my first experience with writ panels, and we hear, oral arguments from the appellants, and then we confer, and on my panel, the Chief Justice was on there, and it was also Justice Harrison was sitting, and who else? I think maybe then John Charles Thomas might have been on the panel. I don't remember. There were like 3 or 4 of them and me, and we go to the back, and after all these arguments, and the Chief Justice turns to me and he says, "What did you think about the first case?" And I'm like, "I thought it was, the lawyer made a very good argument. I was wondering about this issue, that issue." And so then he asked me about the second case, and similar types of things. And after the third one, I said to the Chief Justice, I said, "Well, I really appreciate your, you all are very gracious. None of the other justices had said a word, but I said, I'd be interested to know what you think about these 3 cases." And the Chief Justice turned to me and he said, "Well, don't you know the rule?" And I'm like, oh boy, I messed up already. And I said, "Well, I'm not sure which rule you're talking about." And he said, "Well, the rule on this court is as long as one justice thinks the case should be granted, we go ahead and grant it. We just don't talk about it anymore because we've got too much work to do." So 3 cases got granted because I didn't know the rule. So there were things like that, those institutional operating procedures that you don't know. And I will say that was the rule then, and it is the rule now. I mean, there's just too much work to sit and debate at the petition granting stage. Now, there's quite a bit of debate often, around once you're deciding the cases. But there were things like that I just didn't know, and you just kind of learn and hope somebody guides you well along the way. You don't break your leg or stick your foot in your mouth too much on the. I remember also that, and this is just an aside, but when I went on the State Corporation Commission, I couldn't believe it. Here's the group that regulates telephone companies. And of course I know there's the state system, but our phones were a single phone with a line that came in. Now you could transfer that line, but if you were on the phone and somebody called you, you get a busy signal. Okay. And I had told at that time Preston Shannon that it would really be nice if we could at least get one of those phones that has 4 or 5 buttons that light up, if one of my kids had to call me. So yeah, that was here. So I get here and it's the same old phone system, and I'm like, So I went to the Chief Justice and I said, "Justice Carrico," then Chief Justice Carrico, could I possibly get a phone system where at least my secretary and I would have lines we could both answer in the event, you know, I get a call, she can pick it up. And he said, sure, that's not a problem. He said, but you know, here, no one's going to call you. You're not going to need that second line. He was right. He was right. But actually, I always wanted it as a safe backup for my kids and family. So, and it's not true that no one ever calls you, but it certainly is not like it was at the State Corporation Commission or in an active law practice.
I was wondering, some of the other justices that I've interviewed have indicated that there were some adjustments that they had to make with a female justice. And I was wondering, were you aware of any of those adjustments, or did you find the behavior of the justices different toward you than perhaps what you saw how they reacted to one another?
Well, it's interesting, and a lot of people have said to me, what was different when you went on the court? And I've said, you have to ask my colleagues, because I don't know what was different. I only know what happened when I was here. I have heard them say that they have really had to clean up their language, which I have no reason not to believe them, but I never had a sense that they felt stifled or anything like that in what we were talking, when we'd be talking in here. And yeah, it would be very, I can't really say I can't identify any particular instance or activity that was different because I was here. I mean, you know, a lot of jokes are made about the bathrooms and all that, and that was always a joke down in the robing room. There's one door to the bathroom and all that. And actually, it wasn't until there were 3 of us we finally figured out some way to regulate telling who's in there. You know, 3 women. I mean, so. But no, the difference, I suppose. And I can't say this was a difference before or after, but with the exception of John Charles Thomas, when I went on the court, I really felt, I mean, there was a huge generational difference, an experiential background difference. Of course, I suppose at that point Justice Russell was probably in his 50s, but to me seemed like he was in his 80s. Oh, he would have been mid-50s at least. But I mean, Justice Carrico could have been my father. And then some, probably. And so there was a very different, that seemed different when your peers all of a sudden are people that are substantially older than you are and have had a much longer but also very different experience base, especially when, for the majority of them, not all, of course, John Charles Thomas was younger than I was, but not only did they have a different experience base than I did, theirs were very similar to each other. So that really was a little different. And you know, you do feel, when I say feel isolated, I don't mean it's because of anything that they did or didn't do. It's just that I was in a different world. And you know, that was, I was very much aware of that. Felt that. I mean, not that it was, not that they ignored me or didn't bring me. They were incredibly welcoming, couldn't have been nicer. I think we had a very good relationship. I did with the court. I hope they felt the same way. But I was a new kid on the block, you know, and it was a new block, a new day.
Do you think it was this closeness that some of the other justices experienced or had because of their relationship with one another or the socioeconomic group that they were a part of, that kind of created this camaraderie among them that made you feel perhaps not necessarily out of that group, but not really a part of that group?
Well, it's a hard thing to describe because I certainly felt a part of the group in the sense that I was included in everything. There was no exclusion. It's just that my life, I mean, their view of certain historical events was very different than mine. Either I wasn't alive, I mean, I didn't go through the war. I never was in the military service. Football's interesting to me, but it's not something that and I say that, but you know, Justice Russell was a sailor. He wasn't a football player. So, you know, it's very hard to say that there was that's just what the situation was, and we just, you know, we got along fine, and you make adjustments, and you know, that's what your working environment is at that time. And I mean, I don't know if I did things that drove them up the wall that they would talk about when I wasn't around, and maybe I did, but I tried to accommodate each other's interests, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that that whatever cases you're supposed to be in charge of occurred with the passing around of the hat.
Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't yeah, you're right. I see what you're saying.
Do you remember your first cases?
I remember one that I had first session. I can't remember the rest of them, but I do remember this one. It was a personal injury case where a logging truck was coming down a hill. And the issue in the case was, under our rules of evidence, should the jury have been told, or should there have been a testimony about the braking distance for a logging truck coming down the hill. And the court has always been somewhat adamant that we shouldn't have accident reconstruction, you know, that some expert comes in and tries to, and so I had been assigned that opinion, and it's going around the table, and the opinion writer is always last. Comes to me, and it's, you know, like 6-1, or 6 people, they're all saying affirm, it shouldn't have come in, that was right. And I just thought that was kind of the wrong answer, because I figured if they're by statute they can introduce what the braking distance is going certain speeds for cars, why shouldn't you be able to have it for a logging truck? I mean, it wasn't a car. So, but I didn't say anything because I was the new guy on the block. So I went and I wrote the dissent. I mean, I wrote the opinion, and then I also wrote the dissent. So when we got back together to discuss the opinions, I said, you know, if you agree with this opinion, that's fine, but someone else is going to have to put their name on it because I will dissent. And once again, it was a rule I didn't know. They said, well, don't you know you never have to write an opinion to a case that you're going to dissent in? And I said, well, okay, tell me how that works. And they said, well, when it comes around to you, just say I can't write it this way, and then you'll switch off opinions with someone else in which you are in the majority. So I do remember that one. And at that time, too, we only had one law clerk. We were each writing they were engaged in a huge program to eliminate the backlog. The court was taking 4 years or more to decide cases, and there were some real backlogs because of this petition process and all of that. And so we were having some pretty strenuous workloads. And I mean, I can't remember anything in particular, probably from the first year I was on the court, just because of it was just, you know, as I talked about getting up to speed in the commission, it was equally as demanding at the court.
What was your basic approach to the mechanics of how you would write a decision?
Well, like every case that comes before the court, and particularly with those with which you believe you're going to write it, a huge amount of work is done before oral argument. Familiarity with the record, the research, the issues, all of that. Really, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of research before oral argument, and that I'm really saying before conference. Because as you go around the table, more often than not, with 7 different lawyers, very competent lawyers, each one may see a different point, a different angle, and you need to be able to not only listen to what they're saying, but in your own mind process it to see if it affects some of the things that you think. So that process is extremely important. We used to actually record conferences, opinion conferences. I found that to be very helpful, because as you go back into your office and if you're having to take notes on what everybody is saying at that time, it doesn't allow you to think that much. And so then you go back and try and remember, and as you get into writing the opinion, you might even find an area or a subject or an issue that one of your colleagues hit right on the head, but you didn't realize it at the time, and now you got to go back and try and remember exactly what it was he or she said. So we don't do that anymore, but that made it a little bit easier, I think. But so you've gone through all of that, you've worked it out with the clerk. Sometimes, again, depending on time and cases, sometimes I like to have a draft of the facts written out, because it's like anything else. When it's much easier to talk to each other like we are here. When you have to put it down on paper, you really realize some of the nooks and crannies and nuances that you hadn't really thought through, or there's a hole in it, or a timeline, or what did that mean? You know, and you don't just kind of go over it the way or skip over it the way you might in an oral exchange. So sometimes I would have the facts written out. I'd maybe have my law clerk do it, and then I would look over it to see if there's a big hole there in case I needed to ask some questions at oral argument or bring up a point in opinion conference. I don't do that all the time, but I like to, if I can, if we have time to do it, it's very helpful. And then once I have, of course, in my own mind, I'll have a tentative view on each one of the issues that's before us, and I've always talked, you know, my clerks and I've talked it out. And then we go through opinion conference, and then we'll go back and write it. And I use my clerks a lot. I don't know that I can say they do a first draft of the substantive part. Sometimes they do, but normally, and over the years, these clerks are newbies. You know, it's their first year out of law school mainly, and they don't want to give me a first draft. They want to give me a final product, and they really agonize over it. You know, even if I'm telling them how it's supposed to come out and what the rationale is. And in our 7-week cycle, I just don't have time. We've got to keep moving. So very often, the first draft of that part I will put together, and then it starts going back and forth with the clerk and I, in terms of structure, organization. I think it was Justice Russell used to tell me that sometimes he'd have his clerk write a dissent to it just so he could see where there were problems. But even once you have all the research down, you know the rationale you're going to deal with for the decision that you're coming up with, then there's huge organizational issues. What do you deal with first, second, and third? And a lot of times that will get changed and moved around in block. And I mean, and you remember, you have to write these opinions, or you should write these opinions in a way that are understandable to people. So we go through a good bit of that kind of review. You mentioned the computer earlier. I came on this court, word processing was not standardized, but you know, we had it at the commission, and I was pretty much used to it. And I do use that all the time now. I mean, probably one reason is that my fingers can type faster than they can write, although that's not to say they type with all the correct letters. But the problem with the word processor is it, again, almost makes you want it to do it correct the first time. And so I try and adhere to what I call the Splat Theory, which is let's get something down. I mean, writing is all about editing. I mean, that's really what a good writer is a good editor. So, and it may mean that as an editor you see that there are areas that you didn't get down the first time and have to go back and add to it. Or take away, because no one wants to read all of that. Just because you did the research does not mean it all has to wind up on the paper. There's no prizes for that. So that's pretty much the process that I follow. I mean, we do a lot of pre-argument research and reading and discussing where the weaknesses or the strengths of the case are, what the other, you know, what precedent tells us where we should be going, thinking about if we decide X, what does that mean when we've got X plus 1, the next case, that type of thing. So it's basically pre-work, maybe getting the facts down ahead of time, organizing the result. And sometimes you get to the point that even the whole court has agreed on a certain result, but by the time you try and write that, if the phrase is, it just doesn't write. It just can't go that way. And then you kind of start over and tell the court why you had to do something different.
So it sounds like your background, your background in mathematics and your experiences, organizing plays, organizing student government activities and so forth, somehow played a role in how you organized your arguments, and whether it's, I would say not a direct role, but just a general organizational or perspective role.
Well, yeah, I think that, I don't know if those things played into it, but I do like, I'm a list person, you know, I like to know what's happening where, and I did some teaching with a guy named Steve Armstrong early on about opinion writing, and in fact, he's a journalist. He's not a lawyer, but worked for Sterling. I can't remember the name of the law firm in New York City, and a lot of talking about organization, structure, different ways of organizing, and a lot of what he talked about was being aware of the different ways you can do things and trying to, in any given opinion, to pick a way so that your reader can follow with you and you're not kind of, then you're over here and then you're up there and then you're not. It's not a sermon, you know, it's a written document. So yes, organization structure is quite important, although there's also, you get into a certain formula or formulaic approach to it. You know, you reinvent. It's like when I teach on appellate advocacy, rules of most appellate courts tell you it has to have statement of facts, table, you know, all this kind of stuff, and there's not a lot of benefit in reinventing that, because who's ever reading it is expecting to see all of those elements in a certain order. So opinions have some of that same thing to it.
Now, you have the reputation for demanding that a lot of the legalese be removed. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I believe in, you know, simple sentences of not you can't have all subject, noun, you know, 3-word sentences. I like to use the active voice as much as possible rather than the passive voice. On the other hand, to make something read well, you can't, if it's all active voice, it becomes very stilted, you know, that type of thing. As far as the legalese goes, I think everybody on the court pretty much shares that philosophy. They just soon avoid lots of stilted or archaic phrases. I think probably the best writer, well, we've got a lot of good writers. Justice Russell's a good writer, but they all are good writers, basically. And you know, I do try, and I've always said, you know, we have page limits on briefs, and I'd rather read 100 pages of a well-written brief than 50 pages of garbage. You know, so it isn't the length so much, it's the way it's written. So I try and keep that in mind when I'm writing, is that can people follow it? Is it clear? And in writing opinions, it's, you know, you hear about Oliver Wendell Holmes and, you know, some of the great opinion writers of the centuries, past centuries. And I think that's good. I feel we have to be extremely careful in not saying too much, but saying enough, because lawyers take every line, every phrase, every sentence in your opinion and put their own spin on it. So you really have to be careful that you are not saying, not leaving yourself open to an application which was an unintended consequence of your opinion.
Do you recall any opinions that were reversed at the federal level that the state Supreme Court rendered an opinion of?
Oh yes, there were a number of them. That's kind of our system.
And were you in agreement with the federal court's reversal?
I think in some I was, in some I wasn't. I can't remember all of the cases that have gone up. I know the one I was not in agreement in, I mean, I thought the Supreme Court was wrong. You know, we had one on treatment of federal and state retirees with regard to some taxes. We had one, oh, what was the one recently? Well, they just, the cross burning case, I can't say that I, as an individual, dislike the result. I think that they reversed themselves. I mean, we were following what the law was in the area, and then they said, no, but we're not going to do this. We're going to change the law. Okay, that's what they're there for, and they can do it. So, you know, that's kind of a mixed bag, because we are charged, we're sworn, we take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and the court had been saying the Constitution says X, and so we said X, and then they said, nope, it says Y. Well, I don't disagree with Y. I mean, personally, I like Y, but, you know, that's fine. And then there are others. There was one recently that I really, it had to do with the ability to, it was one they reversed, and I was in the majority here, and of course reversed on appeal, had to do with the getting stopped by a policeman for a minor traffic event, and then they wound up searching the car. It was for something they were only supposed to give him a warrant. They couldn't even arrest him. So they arrested him and then did a search subject to the arrest. We've never, you know, they had said you can't do that, and now they said you can do that, and now that one I disagree with. I think they shouldn't have changed the laws. But that's my personal opinion. That's not what I have to do as a judge.
Well, let's go back to your clerks.
Mm-hmm.
Each justice has a different set of qualifications and requirements. Where did you get your clerks? Was there a particular law school that you preferred, or were there certain qualifications you were looking for?
Well, as a Virginia member of the Virginia Supreme Court, I felt a responsibility to Virginia, to law schools in Virginia, and of course we have a plethora of very good law schools here. So that's, you know, I had a bounty for forever. Although I had students from other law schools, although a qualification as the years went on, it really became a requirement, was that they had some connection to Virginia, and I really almost needed them to either graduate from a Virginia law school or have taken the Virginia bar. And the reason for that is that we deal strictly with Virginia law, and the learning curve is really steep. And once again, we only had one law clerk until the last few years I was on the court. So, well, I take that back. I had two law clerks. I asked the then Chief Justice Carrico if I could have two law clerks when I came on the court. Because remember, I said they were doing this delay reduction, which was an extra workload for those who'd been on the court for a number of years. And I was just, and we had some extra FTEs that weren't being used and so forth. And so the Chief Justice told me I could have one. So when I started out, I had two law clerks, and I staggered them. Each one would stay for 2 years, so there was an overlap. And that went on for about 2 years, I think, and then the court decided I didn't need two law clerks anymore, so I went back to one. So the majority of my time, I just have had one law clerk up until, I guess, maybe 3 years ago. They got two law clerks back again. So with one law clerk, I mean, they really needed to have as much ready to go as possible. So a Virginia connection or the Virginia bar was an important aspect to me. I, would go through the resumes, and I'd often have my existing clerks go through their resumes too. And I would, grades are important, class ranking is important. Kind of just trying to get a sense of somebody, and then I'd narrow it down to, I probably never did more than 6 to 10 interviews at the most. It's very time consuming. But I had them do a writing test. And everybody got the same basic set of facts, and they were to write, sometimes I'd have them write an opinion that was supposed to come out a certain way, and sometimes it would be a bench memo, but they'd all write, every year, they'd all write the same thing. And I'd review that. It wasn't, they didn't have to do much research for it. They didn't have to do any research for it, actually. But writing is very important, and making sure they could get it back to me within a time limit was important. I need to move, you know. We don't just sit here and talk. So that was another thing that I would do in picking my clerks. And sometimes it really changed the waterfront in terms of what I thought, and I personally interviewed all these people. And they did the writing sample after the interview.
So was it important to you to have any diversity among your clerks, or whoever came up at the top? It didn't matter to you?
No, I tried. I always had a pretty good application pool gender-wise, male, female. That was a pretty mixed bag. As far as the diversity, I had trouble. I mean, we had really tried to. The fact of the matter is that talented, qualified minority graduates of the law schools get incredible picks of the jobs because everybody wants them. And state Supreme Court justices are, while they're probably above state trial judges, they certainly are below almost any federal position. I'd say than any federal clerking position. And the other thing, of course, it all depends, but I mean, our salaries are pretty good, but law school's so expensive these days. And, you know, a lot of people that would like to do public service just can't afford it. They have to get these loans paid off. I mean, their loans are, I think the average law school graduate loan now, the average, so that means some have none, is like in the neighborhood of $110,000, maybe more. That's a lot to start off with. So, you know, I mean, I really, yeah, it was important to me, but I was not very successful at all. I had some, let me think, had one person of Pakistani origin, national origin. Had no Latinos, no African Americans, no Native Americans. I think that's about.
And on average, how long did you keep each of your clerks? Was it for a 2-year period, or
well,
did it vary?
If you take my entire term, it would be a year. When I first got the 2 clerks, and I said they stayed for 2 years and staggered, that was nice for me. I found, though, that for the law clerks themselves, 18 months would be an ideal time. That last 6 months, they've kind of been there, done that, they're ready to move on, and I understand that. But that does not coincide with the hiring cycle of the law firms. So, as a result, I basically stuck to about a year. Now, and in some instances, the law clerks, I don't think, got the credit for that second-year clerkship within their law firm when they went the way they should have. So it was not necessarily that beneficial to them. Now, had I gone out, now that we have 2 law clerks, or that they have 2 law clerks, I may have gone back still to that staggered 2-year thing, because it's really tough to interview and bring in 2 new people every year. I mean, that's a lot. So, and I think, I'm not sure how, every justice is doing it a little bit different, but I think that a lot of them are looking at doing a staggered term type thing. So, we'll see.
Well, now, during your tenure on the court, the General Assembly changed some rules regarding how the court did things. One rule in particular had to do with the Chief Justice's position. And I was wondering if you knew any of the background to why the General Assembly wanted to change that.
I know nothing is fact.
Just the...
And there was a lot of talk.
How did you feel about that change in the rule?
Well, I had never, I had and have always thought that there's a lot of good that goes with seniority, but it's not the best for everything. And changing the position from a strictly seniority for lifetime job, I thought was not a bad idea. I think as in any institution, and this is it's not a bank, it's not an insurance company, but it's not a small business, but it is an institution like those. And I think that preparing for successorship and which allows continuity but movement is extremely important as a institutional matter. And I think good leaders do that. I mean, you look at all major companies, and the preparation for succession is one of the most important things. What's the biggest problem? It's when all of a sudden somebody gets dumped and who's coming in. I mean, their stock just falls. We're not a stock company, and I don't, the analogy, of course, is not perfect. But I felt, and had said that I felt that changing the method of determining who a Chief Justice would be is good. I also think that because you're the Chief Justice is the head of a judicial branch, that turnover should not be rapid. I know states in which it's every 2 years. That's a lot of turnover. Now, if you have a state in which your court administrator, chief court administrator, is the major administrator and really is running everything else, then it's not so bad. But 2 years is not enough. I mean, I think that could be somewhat unwieldy and not good for certainly a state which has as large a judiciary as this, or judicial branch as this one does. So I think that looking at new ways to do it was a really good thing. I mean, I don't think there was anything negative about that.
I was wondering, was there a noticeable difference, obviously two different people, but a noticeable difference in how the court did things, not only with that change in the procedure in the court, but also you saw a change in who was Chief Justice from Carrico to Hassell, and I was wondering, how was that different in your mind? How Justice Carrico handled or managed the court versus Justice Hassell?
Well, I mean, it's very different. I mean, they're strikingly different, but then they're two very different people.
In what ways were there differences?
Oh, I mean, it would be, were just huge differences between the two. And, you know, as they say, there are a lot of ways to skin a cat, and different people do things different ways. And there's no ideal Chief Justice of the country or of the state or whatever. So I just think it is one of those situations where, you know, whenever a new person, whether it's a governor or an attorney general or a Chief Justice, they are going to set up and not only set out their own priorities and ways of doing things that they're most comfortable with, and they're not going to be the same. But does that make them bad? I don't know.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could give us like one or two examples of how Justice Carrico did something versus Justice Hassell, just to give us a sense of the difference that you witnessed in how they managed the court.
Well, that's kind of a hard question, because some of that also depends on what the other members of the court, how involved they want to be or not be. When I first came on the court, my colleagues really were not, I think, were not at all interested in being involved in any of the administrative processes, or at least minimally so. But it was also, you know, Chief Justice Carrico was Chief Justice for what, 20 years? And I'm sure my colleagues' predecessors had kind of just gotten into a pattern with him also. Plus the whole concept of a court administrator hadn't existed when he first became Chief Justice, so he created all that. I think the members of the court became more interested in being a little more aware of and in on what was going on. And so they are. Issues of security are much different now than they used to be. I mean, Justice Carrico prided himself on the fact that he drove himself everywhere. I mean, if you suggested he should have a driver, he thought that was improper and a waste, challenging his abilities and a waste of state taxpayer money. Our current Chief Justice has a different viewpoint on that. And of course, it's a different time, pre-9/11, post-9/11. You know, so there are some very, very different things, but when I came on the court, the Chief Justice we didn't have, the fourth floor wasn't sealed off, and you didn't have those little stickers, and now you do. So I think that, you know, it's important that any leader be sensitive to what needs to be done at the time he or she is leading, and work within that, you know, within that framework. Again, in a manner that he or she is comfortable and also gets the job done. So yeah, there are changes, substantial changes, but I can't say, you know, it's not a matter of this is bad or this is good. I mean, if we hadn't had 9/11, should we have all this security here? Probably. But, you know, would Justice Carrico have put it in? Probably. You know, I just don't know.
I was wondering, as I've interviewed other justices, there have been some who had an interesting sense of humor, some who liked practical jokes and so forth, and so I was wondering if you noticed any particular ones who had a lively side that, you know, people from the outside wouldn't necessarily see.
Well, I think they all do. It's like anything else. When you're with somebody on a pretty regular basis, you get to know him or her in ways that other people might not. I mean, I think all of my colleagues throughout the years have been good-natured. I don't know if there's a grumpus. I mean, there are days that are bad, but I don't think we have a grumpus or a curmudgeon. Even those that might be perceived as curmudgeons, just if you see them on the bench. No, I think they are, you know, they're all good people. They're all people of goodwill, and when we're together, funny things happen, and standing jokes happen, and you know, people are just, we don't get together that much. I mean, probably that is the biggest change I've seen in the two courts. I say two courts, I'm saying the court that I first came on, and, because when I came on the court, we had Chief Justice Carrico, then Chief Justice Carrico, Justice Sept, well, Justice Sept came on right after I did, but well, there was Justice Sept, but before him it was John Charles Thomas. So there was John Charles Thomas, Chief Justice Carrico, Justice Compton, Justice Russell, and myself, and Justice Poff, who was a senior justice at that time. So that was 6 people who had their main offices here. Now, there are 3 of us, Justice Sept, Justice Lemons, and myself. So only 2 active justices have their offices here. So that makes a difference. I mean, so these other people you see 6 days every 7 weeks. So that's a little bit different. The social part of it, I guess, is different.
What was the cause of the change?
Well, where they lived. I mean, Justice Kinzer lives in Pennington Gap. Justice Keenan lives in Northern Virginia. Justice Millett lives in Manassas. Justice Goodwin lives in Chesapeake. I mean, before then, Russell, all the rest, we all lived here. So we all came to work every morning. We all were in the same building. You know, we all used to go out to lunch together every single day. You just don't do that anymore because there just aren't that many people. And of course, I'm retired, so I don't try it. I'm not here pretty much as much as I can. Well, I'm here, but not that much.
I was wondering, there were some interesting and difficult cases that you had to look at. And one in particular I wanted to ask you about, and this was the Martin case, the whole redistricting.
Mm-hmm. The one, are you talking about the one that I wrote?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what were some particular challenges that you had in looking at this case, because all sides acknowledged there were some racial factors, but that wasn't really the dominant issue in that particular case. And there was I'm not going to say a firestorm of debates that it ignited, but certainly there was a lot of controversy about it. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came up with your decision.
Well, I probably should, and I mentioned this before, but you know how lawyers have specialties? Well, if I had any specialty, it was redistricting. And it is not something you can make much money off because it only happens once every decade. But in the 1960s, I did the redistricting, motion for rehearing, when the multi-member districts were thrown out in Dallas and San Antonio before the United States Supreme Court. In the 1970s, I argued, briefed and argued, those were the cases I argued before the United States Supreme Court, again, multi-member, single-member districts. In the 1980s, I was working for the Attorney General's office here and worked on drafting the actual redistricting plans and defending them for Virginia. In the 1990s, I was on this court, and although I didn't write the opinion, I was part of that decision. And then in 2000, I got to write the opinion. So short of being on the United States Supreme Court, I've been the lawyers, I've been the everything. So redistricting is an area which was not a new area for me, and I was pretty familiar with the matters and controversy. The biggest problem with the redistricting case that we had were mainly procedural problems. They didn't have plaintiffs from certain areas. They didn't have a record. The plaintiffs that were there, the attorneys I guess, but they hadn't presented a record in certain areas. And the other part is that very often, you know, on appeal, you take the facts in the light most favorable to the party that has prevailed below. So in some of those areas where we affirmed, it's like saying, well, you know, some other fact finder may have gone another way, but it wasn't that there wasn't enough evidence. It was very interesting because Pam Carlin was arguing the case for the appellants, and I've known Pam for years. I have tremendous respect for her. I think she's one of the brightest people, best law professors, and certainly outstanding expert on redistricting, and I'm mad at her for leaving UVA and going to Stanford. But it was interesting in listening to her argument because she knew exactly where the problems were and arguments that hadn't been made. So if you read that opinion, so much of it is an issue of the case just wasn't made. Now maybe the case could have been made, maybe it couldn't, but the fact for us is it wasn't. So it was decided on such legal and procedural grounds. I mean, it was a hard case because we saw maps and charts and, you know, records up to here, and it's a lot. It took a lot of work to do it, but it was one of those things. And having watched redistricting over the years as an issue, it has become down to such a minute line. It's whoever gets the first computer plan out first, and it's. Of course, I personally feel when they did away with, in some areas, things like multi-member districts, in today's world, what it has done is caused a lot of isolation among communities, and it has allowed representatives to be able to ignore other huge areas of the population. And in some instances, I think that has redounded to the, not to the benefit of the very communities of interest that we're trying to serve. And I mean, it's a very fine line. It's a political issue. But you look at a small town and you start dividing it up into 4 pieces, and it becomes 4 independent areas, and that's unfortunate. But anyway, that's not what my job is, to write these things. So,
I know we're just about out of time. I wanted to ask one final question.
mm-hmm.
You recently retired. Why?
Because it was time. I think, you know, it's interesting in my life, many of the job opportunities that I've had or positions have not been something that I've planned for. They just kind of were on my doorstep, and as I tell many students, you know, you have to be prepared, you have to have the qualifications, but a lot of it you can't plan for. You just have to be ready when it comes. In this situation, I'd been on the court for 18, 19 years. I was fully vested in my retirement. But I just felt it was time. I was just ready to kind of move on and do so. I just knew it, just felt it was the right time. And I'm not stupid enough, I guess, to think that there isn't anybody that could do my job. There are many people, many lawyers in this state who are well qualified to serve on this court and would do a good job. So I didn't feel that I personally had to stay with the court for some deep-seated reason. But I mean, I like the court and I like the job, but I was ready to and I will say, once I made my decision, and certainly once I announced it, I have not looked back or regretted a day. But having the senior judgeship opportunity in this state is very helpful, because I still am involved in writing opinions and stay with my colleagues and things like that. But you know, I personally think too that it's extremely important for people to recognize that when it's time, and that there isn't a lot of benefit to be gained by your institution or by you personally by hanging on. I don't think my colleagues necessarily would have kicked me out by any means, but it's kind of more fun to go out on that note than thinking, gee, I should have left 3 years ago. So I'm delighted. I'm very happy, and I'm happy I have the opportunity to still engage in service to the Commonwealth through the senior judgeship and other things that I'm doing. So, and besides, grandchildren only come by once.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.